The gender pay gap is an oft-cited example of sexism in society. However, a quick search on YouTube will reveal a lot of people claiming to have destroyed the idea with facts and logic. Even so, researchers and social scientists continue to talk of the gender pay gap, apparently unaware of the debunking it's received by the top minds of the internet. Why is this, and what's the real truth here? Let's have a look at the issue in detail. The basic claim of most feminists when they point to the gender pay gap is simple. Women earn less money than men, and that's just a fact. Those claiming to destroy the gender pay gap don't actually dispute this, rather, they like to offer a list of reasons justifying the pay gap. The task of anyone looking for the truth is to examine the claims in detail and see how they hold up to critical scrutiny. These reasons usually given to justify the pay gap include 1. Danger money. Men are more willing to put themselves at risk in dangerous fields like mining, and these fields need to pay a premium to make up for the danger element. 2. Different career choices. Men are more likely to choose higher paying careers, especially STEM fields like engineering, while women are more likely to choose lower paying careers like nursing. 3. The career break to have babies. Women choose to have babies, and in doing so must put their careers on hold, at least temporarily, for the time surrounding the actual birth, and they often choose to take a longer break than may be strictly biologically necessary while they care for their baby. Meanwhile, the father is still working, gaining experience and gaining promotions. 4. Men choose to work longer hours than women, and so the higher pay is of course expected. Now, let's see if these reasons survive critical scrutiny. Note the repeated use of the word choice, often specifically individual choice, in the way these reasons are typically phrased. This is very important, as it places the responsibility with the individual making that choice, and no one else, no external factors. Indeed, it was a common notion among economists, at least before the arrival of behavioral economics, to view people as rational, self-interested individuals who make choices based on their own individual preferences, homo economicus as they are sometimes called. But no definite specimens of this elusive mystical species have ever been identified, and in fact, evolutionary biology, psychology, and behavioral science are busy demonstrating that we are not, and never have been, homo economicus. We are a social species. In fact, we were social long before we were human. And like other primates, we are highly susceptible to influences, expectations, pressures, and role models that we see in the real world. Things outside of us that influence our decisions. I once woke up to find someone had bricked my car window during the night. If I was using the same approach to investigation as the debunkers of the wage gap, I might ask, why is my window broken? Yep, I see it. Brick. That would explain it. The brick entered through the window and broke it in the process. This explanation is obviously technically correct, while being incomplete to a potentially misleading degree. It excludes any factors beyond the brick itself, such as who might have thrown it and why. Given that we are a social species, and our choices are so susceptible to outside influences, stopping our investigation into the gender wage gap at the career choice part is like stopping the investigation of the broken window as soon as we find the brick. So, with each of the choices above, let's have a deeper look and see what might be behind these choices. If we don't understand the deeper causes, we won't get the full story. 1. Danger money. I won't spend too much time on this because dangerous jobs are quite a small percentage of the whole, and critically, the wage gap persists even if we exclude those jobs. Data from the OECD show that the pay gap is a similar size, often even larger, among tertiary educated white-collar jobs. These are by and large non-dangerous jobs. This is not generally considered to be a significant part of the pay gap, so we'll leave this here. 2. Different career choices. Let's have a look at some relevant facts, rarely mentioned, though most likely known to those making the individual choices argument. It is a fact that not just nature, but nurture as well affects us, sometimes quite profoundly. How we are raised and the examples we see around us affect our choices, including career choices. It is a fact that we tend to identify more with people like us. Boys are more likely to take their inspiration from male role models, and girls from female role models. It is a fact that the representation of different role models in life is not even. Men are the majority of engineers, and women are the majority of nurses. And you can multiply examples across a range of higher paying versus lower paying jobs, managers versus childcare workers, skilled trades versus hairdressing, etc. Men are more highly represented in higher paying fields, and women in lower paying fields. The lack of women in these fields is a known self-perpetuating barrier to further female entry. Researchers conclude that Women who are exposed to successful females in STEM fields are more likely to do well in STEM classes, feel a greater sense of belonging among STEM classmates and colleagues, and are more likely to have pro-science career aspirations. The most significant role models tend to be those we know personally, and so it should be no surprise that boys are more likely to enter higher-paying STEM fields and women enter other lower-paying fields. These are just the examples they see around them. However, it's also a fact that we are influenced by other areas, and in these areas also, the gender representation is highly uneven. In movies, for example, women were only 26% of movie protagonists last year, and men therefore 74%. But female movie characters were also less likely to have an identified job, and less likely to be seen doing that job. Toys as well have a definite gender bias. A walk down any toy aisle is usually enough to demonstrate this. Toys marketed to boys and advertised by male advertising models are often STEM-related, such as Technic Lego and other similar mechanical kits. Toys marketed towards girls tend to be about social interactions, dolls and so on. No boy I'm aware of ever sat down to have a tea party with his Technic gears and little electric motors, and no girl I'm aware of ever built a functioning machine out of her Barbies. Taken together, and with many other influences such as children's books, TV shows, etc., it's not surprising that boys and girls have often decided on gendered career choices from an early age. They are more likely to draw managers and scientists as men, nurses and teachers as women. This seems to be a clear result of a kind of conditioning. Not a consciously designed kind of conditioning, obviously, where boys and girls are put into Skinner boxes and get a reward every time they say, I want to be a nurse because I'm a girl, or something like that. But a much larger form of unconscious conditioning from simply being exposed to a society which already includes a lot of gender segregation. Culture, almost by definition, is something that is often passed down from generation to generation. To put it another way, it would be absolutely remarkable and counter to everything we know about behavioral science if things like the representation of men and women in different fields, exposure to media, toy design, etc., had no influence on children whatsoever, and their careers were entirely their own choices. But what is the reason for these cultural factors in the first place? How did the culture get this way, with men in higher-paying STEM fields and women in lower-paying ones? That's probably a much longer discussion about the evolution of society as a whole, but we can get a rough idea from considering some key historical facts. Since prehistoric times, men have used their physical strength advantage to dominate women. Stories are common in which the men of a tribe or village raid a nearby one and carry off all the women. Stories of women raiding and carrying off men seem to be non-existent. As we moved from hunter-gatherers to hierarchical societies, these differences in power often became enshrined in law. Property went to the firstborn son, not daughter. And of course, for a long time, women simply were not educated, while men were. When James Watt was refining the steam engine in a way that was to have a lasting impact on the Industrial Revolution, and hence the world, the general belief and practice in political circles was that women should receive only a domestic education, not a rational one. It should be no surprise that men were therefore the ones laying the foundations of STEM fields like engineering, and these stereotypes and role models have persisted to this day. The destroyers of the gender pay gap argument rarely, if ever, seem to acknowledge that factors such as psychological conditioning even exist, let alone try to quantify them scientifically, as anyone who wants to destroy feminists with facts and science should really be doing. This cultural factor has some important implications for the different career choices justification. The cultural basis for the career segregation is in fact exactly in line with most feminist claims. Their complaint in the first place is that we as a society pay women less. If part of the explanation for it turns out to be, oh, but actually it's okay because, you see, we condition them to choose lower paying jobs, then it's difficult to see how this might help the case of the debunkers. It also has practical implications. Culture is not a permanent, immutable thing, nor did it arrive by some divine providence. It was man-made, often literally by men, and it can be, and has been, changed. Which, after all, is exactly what feminists are trying to do. At the end of the day, there are still those who believe that the differences in career choices are due to nature, not nurture, and that things like movies and toy design only reflect inherent gender differences as movie producers and toy designers cater to existing demand. So, they claim, the causal arrow is actually the other way around. The gender segregation of different fields is only natural, and it's actually these natural biological differences between genders that drive things like children's toy design. However, this is difficult to reconcile with available evidence. Advertising can respond to demand, but it also amplifies existing demand, increasing the segregation more than it otherwise would be, and can sometimes even create demand from nothing by making something appear cool. To be properly scientific about this, we would need to do something like raise children in isolation from all cultural influences, and then try to see which careers they choose, which is, of course, impossible. However, things such as the changing gender demographics in different times and different places demonstrate that culture must play an important role. Consider, for example, the employment of female researchers in different countries. Why are women researchers a much higher proportion of the whole in Central Asia than they are in East Asia? Is there something biologically different between Central Asian women and East Asian women, or between Bolivian and Chilean women? Consider also the changing perception of scientists across time. In 1983, when asked to draw a scientist, only 0.6% of children drew that scientist as a woman. But this proportion has grown steadily over time, averaging about 28% rather than 0.6%. Has the inherent nature of women and girls changed over the past few decades? Of course not. These phenomena, the different representation of women in STEM fields over different places and times, are much better explained by cultural differences. Differences in nurture, not nature. 3. Women take career breaks to have babies. Of course, biology dictates that a woman needs to take some time off to reproduce, while a man does not. However, there are 3 very important clarifications here, rarely discussed. First, if we exclude biological necessity, the gender division of childcare is still not even. Women still do far more than men. After the mother has taken off time for the actual birth and earliest stages of the baby's life, she will often stay off work for longer while the man continues working. But it needn't be this way. The only thing a woman has, which a man doesn't, that is essential for early childcare, is a pair of breasts. And even these haven't been strictly necessary since the invention of the rubber-nippled bottle in the 1800s. Perhaps, again, cultural influence has an effect. The nurturing side of men is very rarely shown after all. If parenting were more evenly split between genders, this would undoubtedly go some way toward reducing the gender pay gap. Second, the claim that women choose to leave the workforce to have babies is again dependent on the individual choice narrative. This seems to play out differently in developing versus developed nations. In developing nations, perhaps those uncorrupted by Western feminism, as some would put it, the number of children women have is almost always higher than they wish it to be. The fact that these women are forced or pressured to have more children than they want presumably exacerbates the gender pay gap in these countries more than it would otherwise be, and helps to keep these women poor. In the first world, the reverse is often true. Women have less children than they want. In fact, serious concerns have been raised about falling fertility below replacement levels in developed nations such as Japan and various European countries. In Singapore, the problem is severe enough that the government sponsors a kind of sex day to encourage people to actually breed. But why is this? Is there something about economic development that makes people like children less? One clue to the deeper reason is that level of education is inversely correlated with fertility. Perhaps educated first world women know that their financial prospects are hindered by children and thus may choose to have less of them than they might otherwise like to do. If we in the first world increased fertility to replacement levels, all other things being equal, the gender pay gap would actually worsen. So, in the developing world, which accounts for most of the world's population, the women choose to leave the workforce to have children argument is problematic, since they have more children than they would actually like to choose. In several places in the developed world, the women choose to have children argument does appear to hold up in that women are not, on average, pressured to have more children than they want. However, it does raise the very important question of how monetary value is assigned to different activities in society. The hypocrisy of this argument is especially glaring when made by the nationalist types who want a future for white children. If we increase taxes on cigarettes, for example, this punishes people economically for smoking, and is viewed, correctly, as a disincentive to smoke. When women suffer economically for having children, this must similarly be a disincentive to have children. The economic valuation of different products and services is something I'll come back to at the end. But for now, it suffices to say that the work women do in raising children is, for the most part, unpaid work, however important it might be. The whole argument against the gender pay gap revolves around trying to justify the pay gap in one way or another. But if one of those justifications is, well, actually women do a lot of work, they just don't get paid for it, then maybe we need to think about whether this is, in fact, a justification. 4. Men choose to work longer hours than women. It is true that men work longer hours in formal employment. Formal employment is the key phrase here, however. Men work an average of 42 minutes more per day than women. However, according to the OECD, in every country included in the dataset, women do more unpaid work than men. This includes things like childcare, housework, volunteering, and other unpaid work, and they spend a lot more than 42 minutes per day on it. So again, this comes down to a discussion on how we assign prices and values to things. So let's have that discussion. It's perhaps the inevitable end of a discussion on the wage gap, how we as a society assign value to things, including the different things that men and women do. If we go back to the economists who laid the foundation of modern capitalist economics, such as Adam Smith and David Ricardo, they subscribe to something called the labour theory of value. How is value assigned to something? By how much work it takes to get it. Smith uses the example of a diamond versus an ordinary rock. It takes very little work to find an ordinary rock, and so the value of it is close to zero. It takes a lot of work to find a diamond, and so the value is high. Modern economists generally don't use this definition of value, however, and tend to subscribe to the supply and demand model. The market sets the value. If there is only one electrician in town, but 10 plumbers, the electrician might be able to charge more for his or her time due to scarce supply, even though the time that electricians and plumbers spend getting their qualifications, and the effort they expend at work, might be essentially the same. Where the supply curve and the demand curve meet, the market sets its price. But the thing is, the supply and demand curves are not static. They can and do change with technology, with social and legal norms, and with personal preferences. A new mass production technology might shift the supply curve out to the right, increasing the volume of sales and lowering the price. A speculative bubble or genuine change in personal preference might push the demand curve to the left, such as in the infamous Dutch tulip bubble, which pushed prices of tulips far higher than they had been before or would be since. The actual quality and nature of the tulips hadn't changed, of course, only their perceived value. Supply and demand curves can also change with power in relationships. When NAFTA was signed, it allowed American manufacturers to threaten to close factories and move them across the border to Mexico, which allowed them to lower wages in their factories, or at least avoid raising them, since workers now had less bargaining power. Essentially, the deal had shifted the supply curve of labour outwards, since manufacturers now had the power to outsource labour and thus had access to a foreign workforce who were willing to work for less. And this change was due to a change in the power dynamics. The manufacturers gained the power to outsource. Note that the actual work and the actual contribution of the workers did not change. American workers who lost wages did not have any change to the actual nature of their jobs. They didn't suddenly start being less productive, or working less hard, or start contributing less to society, but a change in the power dynamics changed their wages. The opposite occurred at various times in history when labour movements unionised workers and increased their collective bargaining power to drive wages up. Again, the nature and productivity of their work didn't change. What changed was power. And here is the important lesson. The different wages of different groups do not necessarily reflect how hard those groups work, or the contributions those groups make to society. They represent, in large part, the power of those groups to negotiate their compensation. Consider also the relative salaries of a hedge fund manager and a paramedic. When we get down to the details, it would be difficult to argue that the hedge fund manager works harder than the paramedic, or plays a more vital role in society, and yet he earns not just more, but often many orders of magnitude more than the paramedic. This demonstrates the value that we as a society ascribe to their respective services through the pricing mechanism of the market. Another consideration is the calculation of GDP. When GDP is calculated, it should include all the value of goods and services produced in a given country, state, etc. This includes things like rent. If you rent a house, the value of the rent paid to your landlord is considered in the GDP calculation as part of the landlord's income. But what if you own the house you live in? In this case, an equivalent metric is used to find the value of housing services your house provides to you, as if you were paying rent to yourself, and this too is included in the GDP calculation. But not everything is included in the same way. Critically, housework is not included, and the bulk of this is done by women. If you employ a professional cleaner or babysitter, the wages paid to them are included in the GDP calculation. But if you are your own cleaner or babysitter, unlike if you are your own landlord, then this is not included in the calculation. It should be recognised that this is not an inevitable result of some law of economics. There is nothing stopping us including the value of these housework services in the same way as we include housing services. Rather, it is an ideological decision to exclude certain areas of work from being ascribed value. The result is that the output of women is undervalued, and undervalued because of choices we have made rather than by some inevitable laws of the universe. GDP is of course not the same thing as the income statistics we have been discussing for most of this time, but it does give a good example of how we tend to think and how we tend to ascribe values across many areas in life. The same thinking extends to payment for different sectors. When we see that the sectors in which men work are more highly paid than the sectors in which women work, we need to bear in mind that the pay rates of these services are in practice not something written in stone, nor are they an intrinsic property of the work itself. Rather, the pay rates reflect the power that those groups have to negotiate their salaries, and the value that we as a society ascribe to that work, and the results demonstrate that we, through the market, value the work of women less, which is, after all, what the gender pay gap argument is all about in the first place. If that's not entrenched sexism, I'm not sure what is. Finally, we need to acknowledge that the decision to omit housework disproportionately done by women from the GDP calculation is far from the only ideological choice made in the discussion of this issue. The destroyers and debunkers of the gender wage gap made the decision to stop their investigation of the issue prematurely at the point of the career choices, rather than look into the deeper causes behind this first cause. Why should they do this? Bear in mind that many of them are otherwise intelligent, scientifically literate people who must surely know about things such as the effect of conditioning and role models on people, and the cultural variation in women's employment. That's Psychology 101 and Behavioural Science 101. Their decision to omit these obviously relevant facts from their discussion might be best explained if we view it as an ideological decision rather than a scientific one. By limiting the scope of their inquiry, they can make it appear as if the facts of differing career choice validate their side and refute feminism. The feminist answer, as I have tried to show, is that this really just moves the question. And, having moved the question to what seems like a safe enough distance away, even some smart people in the skeptic community conclude their research secure in having convinced themselves that sexism isn't real anymore, and that they don't have to pay any attention to feminists. But we should be wary of their motives. As Michael Shermer of Skeptic magazine put it, smart people can still believe wrong things, because they're better at rationalizing and defending beliefs they arrived at for non-smart reasons. And I think we can have a reasonable guess as to what those non-smart reasons might be.